G'day, I'm Scott Poynton and welcome to another podcast. And I have the privilege and pleasure today to talk with Mark Bjornsgard. And Mark is the CEO of a fascinating tech company called Deep Green. Mark is also a social entrepreneur of long standing. G'day, Mark. How are you?
Hello. Yeah, very well. Thank you. Very well.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. And I learned about Deep Green through one of the Pond Foundation members who know you and suggested we get in touch, and been fascinated by what you're trying to do at Deep Green. And maybe you can just, I'm fascinated to learn about you, but just tell us quickly about Deep Green and what you're doing there.
Sure. Yes, we know each other through a mutual friend who was actually responsible for what I now think of as our 15 minutes of fame. So Deep Green is what's called an edge data center network. No one will know what that means, but that all that means is that we're building computers where the heat from the computers we can reuse. And we can geek out about how data centers and those sort of things work. But so that's what Deep Green does. We're building data centers, which are these massive, usually are these huge barns full of millions of computers giving off lots of heat. And in the old world, they throw all that heat into the atmosphere. They just eject it into the atmosphere with a load of water. And we, instead of doing that, are building much smaller data centers where the heat's required, which it seems really logical, right? But yeah, it's been 7 years in the making, 7 years, a 7-year kind of overnight success.
Yeah, they often are like that, aren't they? Take a while. And so, and the other thing about these data centers is they spend a lot of money and energy keeping them cool, right? So that the servers and the computers don't overheat.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so, I mean, it is the one bit of the sustainability, well, it's not the one bit, but one of the bits of the sustainability jigsaw that is almost invisible to people. So we all get flying, we all get people driving petrol cars. You know, so a lot of the climate crisis is visible. Data centers are these, as I said, this odd anomaly. We're using something like 3% of the global electricity supply running data centers, and we need them. Don't get me wrong; they're brilliant. The data centers are enabling us to have this call, right? They power our banks. Everything that we know, life as we know it would cease without data centers. So we absolutely need what's going on in them. We just need to build them in a different way, as you say, and they just consume vast amounts of the world's resources and water, interestingly.
Right, and not just locate them in clever places, but I think what you're doing is really intriguing. Locating them, for example, next to pools, right, or next to schools where they currently spend a hell of a lot of money heating pools or heating schools, and you put a data center right next door to it, and boom, they've got energy.
Yeah, exactly. And I sort of always say that if you or I were sitting designing the data center industry today, 50 years ago, we would look at each other and go, well, that's 3% of the world's electricity supply, and all of it, quite literally 97% of that electricity gets turned into heat. And we'd say, well, we'll just site them where we need the heat, right? And we'd both nod, and that would be it. We wouldn't think twice about it. But because, of course, heat recapture and heat recycling wasn't really on the agenda when the industry was conceived, kind of 30 odd years ago, we're left with this sort of legacy structure, which really does need to be dismantled and rebuilt. So yeah, it's a funny one because again, they're really important. They're incredibly important assets within our society. So we can't play fast and loose with them, right? It's important that they're on all the time. Otherwise, our banks don't work and our airlines don't work, and
etc.
Important stuff doesn't happen. So obviously, and human mindsets being what they are, humans struggle to get their heads around doing new stuff. And that's part of the entrepreneurship. That's part of the kind of entrepreneurship gene, isn't it? Part of the muscle is being able to kind of conceive of something new and being able to kind of frame that and then drag people from current reality into the new one, I guess.
Yeah. And look, we'll come back to Deep Green a bit later because I think what you're trying to do there is fascinating, but it is just part of a long history of your own personal journey. And, what's fascinating to me about Deep Green, apart from the innovation and, as you say, the logic of what you're trying to do, you look at it and you say, yeah, geez, why didn't someone think of that before? It's also your personal journey. I mean, you're not just doing it because it's a clever idea. This really stems from your own concern about climate change and social and environmental issues. Tell us a bit about that, mate, and tell us where that came from. I mean, would you think of yourself as a social entrepreneur?
Probably, maybe more so. Certainly more so these days than previously.
Right.
I certainly, and I think when we started to look at investing in the energy space, energy was kind of a bit of a blind spot for me. We weren't looking at it, and I was doing other stuff. And actually, over the years, I think we've become more attuned and more. I guess we were always on that kind of the left of centre. You know, I was always sort of plugged into that sort of, if you like, the kind of the macro political bit of it, if you like.
You've done a lot in health, Mark. I know, right? You've looked at health issues.
Yeah, we sold a business to GSK last year, which was in the dental space, because healthcare in the US, as many people will know, is pretty tricky for a lot of the population. So we were looking at how you could bring kind of a different type of dental service to people, which was super interesting, amazing business. So my first business, I set up with a very old friend who we still we're still in contact, and it was called Artists First. And so the name, again, a bit like Deep Green, the clue was in the title. We built these kind of, this was way back in the day. This was like 25 years ago. We built the very, very first wave of e-commerce technology in the music business. And we were very set on, slightly naively, and we'll kind of come back to that, but we were very set on how we felt the world should be, and it should have been a fairer, more equitable split. And that's kind of, I guess we have been anchored there. We've been anchored there or thereabouts in that kind of, there must be business is a bit dull if it's just business, right?
Yeah.
It only really sort of, I only really get my head around stuff when there's some reciprocity in something, I guess.
Yeah, and where do you think that comes from, mate? Is this, not all business people are wired like that? You know, many people just, right, okay, how do I get my 20% return? How do I get in, get out as fast as I can, move on to the next business?
I think, and part of it is being a history and politics student. So you're always going to be a troublemaker, and you're always going to try and not do anything sensible. One of my daughters is wired like that as well. And it's very annoying to see that gene being pulled through to the next generation. I guess I was, as a kid, I was on quite a conventional path. My parents actually left South Africa because they didn't want to bring kids up in apartheid. So they left with not very much from South Africa. And so I suppose it was always there. I then went back I had this rather kind of cliched gap year in Zimbabwe in the early 90s, which was, I mean, it was beyond brutal. It was the height of the AIDS epidemic.
Right. And
it was interesting. I wrote a diary for that year, so I kept them. And my daughter, my elder daughter, was actually, we were reading some of them a couple of weekends ago, and you kind of remember, you remember a memory, don't you? Rather than, but it really was. I mean, it was, well, for a very for a privileged and very kind of closeted, middle class kid. We were paid as teachers, and we lived in the middle of nowhere. There was no water, no electricity. We lived in basically kind of concrete huts. So it's a terrible cliche, but it was a formative year, I think. And I don't think, I probably already had the kind of DNA of the desire to perhaps that there's something beyond commerce.
Yeah.
But I think there's a caveat to that, though, because Artists First was a super interesting business, and we raised some money, and we were kind of the poster children of that wave of the music industry. But then actually, I trying to do the right thing. There are always unintended consequences, and I'm kind of one to saying that no good deed goes unpunished, right? Mm-hmm. It's actually surprisingly hard to run a business with a triple bottom line. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
because I think you can't lose sight of the business, because then that isn't a business, right? I think a lot of people do, and it is a really hard balance to get right. And I've certainly not got it right all the time. I think the first wave of businesses that we invested in, we actually own a care business as well with British Gas called Lifted. And honestly, I was way too generous with the equity splits on that business, and it created it created the wrong incentives actually. So I think it's not an easy task to run an enterprise that is profit making, but wants to also do the right thing. And look, we're all faced with it now, right? We are in the midst of a climate crisis.
Yeah,
and reciprocity and working with people and collaboration is. Yeah, you're not going to get very far in this world, I don't think, without these sort of principles. So they're like becoming the core of the way you need to run a business. But I'm not sure I'm certainly not a pro at it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And what are some of the barriers you face, mate? I mean, I know from my own experience running a business, a non-profit business, I haven't gone to the market to raise capital, but we have to obviously work with members, with clients, and you're trying to push a set of values out there as well as run a business. As a non-profit, you've still got to make a profit, right? But you're just not distributing it as shares, as dividends. And so there are many similarities, but you've got this one thing that is driving you forward beyond what perhaps a traditional business, and that's the generalisation, because I think there's plenty of CEOs out there of what we might call traditional businesses who are still motivated by looking after their workers, doing good in the world. So, a lot, right? And increasingly, as you say. But, going out there into the world and trying to make that happen. And when someone knocks you back, you're trying to get some funding and they're not seeing the big picture. I'm sure you're facing that with Deep Green right now. What are some of the challenges that you face when you're trying to grow your social enterprise, grow that business from, as you've said, from scratch to scale? How does that work?
For me, I think it's about managing risk, because we had to risk a lot of money to build the first Deep Green site, right? I mean, relative to the kind of capital base of the business.
Right.
So I sort of talk about being part monk, part hitman, and by that I mean, you've got to, as an entrepreneur, the upside is often pretty obvious, right? But it's actually the key to a successful any business really is managing the downside, as I see it. So I think and manage, and by that I mean that is being very, very clear about the risks and the experiments that you're conducting as a business, right? Particularly in the early stages of a business.
Yeah.
Amazon calls it being a day one business. There's plenty of kind of, we all know running a business, assuming that the world's not going to be the same as it is tomorrow as it is today. That is hard, and it's managing risk so that you put yourself out there enough to be able to do something new, but you don't bet the farm.
Yeah, you got to prove the model too, right? You got to prove that this can work.
Yeah, in the smallest, the fastest, and the least amount of money.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of feeds into the whole kind of lean startup movement, which kind of we never really agreed with. Somewhere I've written a book about how it's the lean startup doesn't really work, because you always have to start with being very clear about what you're trying to test. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs, whether it's social entrepreneurs or kind of conventional, if you like, I think a lot of entrepreneurs are very bad at looking at downside risk and are very bad at accepting the reality of their situation. And, for me, so there's this sort of principle. There's a great book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, which I always sort of quote, which is, but good strategy and good relationships and good business starts with a brutally honest diagnosis of where you are.
Yeah.
And if for any reason you can't, as an individual or a team, be brutally honest about where you are, you're just building everything else on sand. Right?
Yeah. And when you say this diagnosis, I mean, what are the elements you look at, mate? I mean,
I'll give a really tangible example. So we've got an investment in a flame detection business.
Right.
And it's a lovely business, brilliant, lovely people. They've worked with us on different hardware technologies, are complete geniuses. And we've spun out a military arm because there's a kind of a military application to it. And the application we were focusing on is forest fires. And you think, well, this is a great, we all want to detect forest fires, right? It's a really big aspect of the climate crisis. And the assumption is that there are millions of people now around the world, because we've all heard of the damage that forest fires are doing. There's assumption is that to detect a forest fire is going to be like a really important thing to do. And this don't need to go into geeky details, but this product is by far the better way of detecting a forest fire. So a lot of entrepreneurs would have said, brilliant, okay, great, I'm going to do that. That's going to be my idea, and I'm going to run with that for 2 years. We threw up a web page with the product on it, and for 24 hours we put that web page live on Google, and had 500 people, complete strangers, clicking through an AdWord, clicking through, seeing whether they wanted the product. No one picked up. Oh. Dead, totally dead. Now, can you as an entrepreneur hear that message? Do you know what I mean? Like a lot of people, we didn't get it quite right. Maybe it's a different image. We didn't get it quite. No. We've done this thousands of times. When zero means zero, nobody wants it. But that's a really hard, when as an individual and as an entrepreneur, you've anchored yourself, you've grounded yourself, it becomes part of your identity, right? Your business becomes part of your identity,
right?
Or your fledgling business. So that's what I mean by risk. I think it's really being able to kind of really, really hear what the world's trying to tell you.
Yeah.
And as I say, I think that's a universal principle, right? In relationships, in business, it's like, what's actually going on here?
Yeah. Looking at the data, as you say, zero means zero, and you can't really get beyond that. But with that project, what did they do when they got that? Did they just say it's dead in the water, or did they look at the data and say, okay?
Well, that's the other thing. Yeah, that's the thing. So nothing's ever dead, right?
Yeah.
It's just not ready. It's just not now.
Right.
So exactly the same data from Deep Green 7 years ago.
Right.
We went to Disney and we said, great news, we can render your movies on hot water tanks. And they were like, there's no way you're ever going to do that. Right. It's just never going to happen.
You're dreaming.
So I think that's, again, humans, we tend to want something binary, but you're allowed to say, it's not right now, but it might be right in a year, or it might be right in 5 years. When you're building businesses, it's. I mean, I talk a lot about hedging risk and a lot about sort of distributing. Even when you're an entrepreneur on your own, you're not meant to be sociopathically committed to an idea.
Right.
What you're meant to be doing is looking at the data and checking that the thing you want to do, the market actually wants. Because business is really simple. You just have to make something that people want to buy, right? It's super simple,
so easy in concept phase, right?
Yeah.
And so patience is obviously pretty key ingredient there. I often say that to people, as you said, an overnight success after 7 years, right?
Right. And we built, I don't know, 5 or 6 businesses in that 7 years. You know what I mean? You don't have to sit, monk-like and kind of contemplate the universe for 7 years. You can, what you do is, you say, well, I've banked that. That's an experiment that I might run in a year's time and see if the world's changed. And for me, entrepreneurship's about building that sort of portfolio approach. So you'll never kind of have to pursue something to the detriment either of the business or of your own mental and financial health,
Your own well-being.
Yeah.
And so that's like about spreading the risk, right? I mean, understanding the risk, but also spreading it out. So you're having lots of irons in the fire. So, I mean, we're doing that with Pond Foundation. We've got a number of members at various stages of their sort of journey to climate action, and we're saying, well, okay, let's help this one go forward, and that one there, well, they're not quite ready yet, but they'll come and they'll move because they seem to be committed. But we've got to give people a bit of space, a bit of time. But I mean, what's your sense? We touched on this a little bit earlier, but what's your sense with where the world is at now? Do you think there's there's a lot of climate despair out there in the world, a lot of talk of terrible inaction, a lot of climate despair, a lot of inaction, and we're seeing it, amongst the politicians and businesses, all this EU legislation on greenwashing and all this sort of stuff now, a lot of greenwashing out there. So, you're going out into the market looking to develop this, product with Deep Green. What are you feeling? What are you hearing? Because my sense is that, you read all those things and you think, God, Jesus, what? And then I'm a forester, so I feel very personally the bloody forest fires that are happening around the world and all the destruction from those things. But what's your sense as you go out into the world, into the market, and looking for investment in this effectively climate change technology? What are you feeling? Are you hopeful? Are you hopeful?
Yes, ultimately, I think. I mean, the reality is that we're trying to develop new technologies very quickly to avert a climate emergency, right? And some technologies money can deploy to and is happy to deploy to. And I think that's part of it, exactly to our previous bit of the conversation. There are a spectrum of risks within climate tech now. The reason why people love deep green is because actually you're just building data centers. It's a known entity. You know what's in there. You know what the asset is. It's a fungible. So it's very easy to understand, and so it's very easy to scale. And if you take carbon capture, or we're invested in heat batteries as well, or there are a bunch of technologies that need to be cooked a bit more. And so I think that's the frustration with a lot of climate entrepreneurs, is that the reality is that their tech, it's just not ready for the big time yet. It's not to say it won't be, but it's not quite ready for the big time. Either the supply chains can't scale or the chemistries don't work. So what's been interesting about deep green is that it was just kind of, once people got it, then it was ready to go. Whereas our heat battery business, it's now scaling. It's now starting to build. But that's been 10 years in the making, probably, James would say.
Yeah.
So I think there's a kind of, with climate, and then all the way to the other end of the spectrum, you've got carbon capture, which is the kind of enormity of the challenge of carbon capture is so great. It's kind of difficult to get your head around. But if we can really crack it, then that could be our get out of jail free.
Could be.
And I think in terms of the kind of the existential bit of this story, and are you hopeful? I talk a lot about the Stockdale paradox, right? There's this guy, Jim Stockdale. He was in a prisoner of war camp in Vietnam. And he says the people who walk in and say they're going to be out by Christmas, they despair and die quickly.
Yeah.
And the people who walk in dispirited and thinking they're never going to get out, they also don't make it. And so I think the climate movement needs to be a bit more Jim Stockdale. I think we all know the horror. We all know what's the bad, right? We know 421 parts per million in the atmosphere of carbon. Last time there was that much carbon in the atmosphere, that sea level was 20 meters higher and there were palm trees in the Antarctic. So, and as you say, the despair is, we're all feeling it. But at some point, we've got to put our big boy pants on, and we've got to just accept that reality, but just get on with fixing it.
I think you could say the F word in that context.
Yeah, and I think that's what I think everyone's got to do every day. We've just got to get up, accept the reality of the situation, that the window to where to avert this catastrophe is closing. And I'm a big, I love the book Limits to Growth. It was written in 1971, and there was a systems thinking, and they said, we are at the limit. We're at beyond the limit in 1971, right? And we've had 50 years since that.
Yeah.
And so, but actually, if we just sit and just, we can't be that. We have to accept. We have to hope that window holds open, and if we can, then we can just get on with fixing it. It's kind of the Buddhist. It's like die before you die, right? We're dead. We've got nothing to lose now. we literally have got nothing to lose. So we may as well all just get shit done.
So I completely agree with you, Mark. My own personal experience was in 2018, middle of the year, about July, I think it was. A professor in the UK, Jem Bendel, came out with a paper, and it was quite fascinating. They published it in the university because it was rejected from various journals, and he more or less said that we are in deep poo, and we've got to start talking about deep adaptation as opposed to stopping climate change, because it's already happening. And he said, it's inevitable that society, our economic reality, our society as we know it, will collapse. And he went through a number of scenarios where he really said, human extinction is certainly not off the table. And that really it's funny because when I read that, I was like, yeah, look, I've sort of known that for a long time just from my own readings and research and the things that I was seeing as I was going out in the bush. We're in deep poo, but somehow it knocked me. And it knocked me for six for a couple of months. And coming around Christmas, I sort of emerged from that. And as I say, I'm generally a positive person, but I emerged from that and I'm like, well, okay, maybe that is the reality, but what are you going to do about it? Are you going to sit there and just wallow in despair and unhappiness like, hey, that was 2018, I was 54 years old. I'd like to think I'd had a bit more life left in me. Am I going to just do nothing? And so the conclusion for me was you've got to get off your bum and you've got to do something. And I think, there's been lots of studies about climate despair in the meantime that says actually doing something, taking steps to, even if it's a small thing, can help alleviate that despair. But actually, you know what? It might move the needle too. And I think there's this assumption that no matter what we do, we can't get out of jail. And I disagree with that. I don't think we know what the future holds. I think that we probably are. We probably are in deep poo. But I know that if we do nothing, we're done. We're cooked. But if we do something, we just might move that needle enough to get us out of jail, as you said earlier. And so the sort of stuff that you're doing with Deep Green and look, the other things you're doing, the other investments that you're making, strike me as being things that are all about taking action to try and make the world a better place. And I'm also one on this whole question of entrepreneurship. I think charity is one thing. We need a bit of charity in the world, but by golly, we need business. We need people to make money out of making the world a better place, because if they do, they'll do more of it. So,
That's the point. Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you the limits to growth, one of the kind of they talk about these sort of meta principles, these meta kind of resources that we have as humans, and one of them is capital.
Right.
And one of the keys to the climate emergency is being able to just physically deploy enough capital into this technology to be able to mitigate it. As you say, and charity absolutely has its place, but ultimately we need, whether we, as Winston Churchill says, it's the least worst system we got, right? So ultimately we do the utility of showing capital that it has a path to do what it does, but let's deploy that capital into the stuff that's not going to cook the world.
Yeah,
that's a really important part of, well, certainly in my thinking. I can't do much about soils. I can't do much about the marine habitat. I can't do much about population explosion, but I do understand capital and I do understand how money works.
Yeah.
There's a really interesting guy. I listened to his brilliant podcast. Danny in the Valley interviewed him a couple of weeks ago, and he's running. Interesting, his business is called Deep Sky, I think. It made a lot of money. I can't remember quite where. I think it was in e-commerce or something, but made a lot of money, and is now he's exactly that, right? He's done all the research, he's done all the data, he's very black and white about it. He's like, look, there's no gray area here. When we've got this much carbon in the atmosphere, and carbon's really interesting. It's like the Himalayas grow, right? You have an ice age. Because the Himalayas grow, all the carbon dioxide gets sucked out of the atmosphere, and you have an ice age. It's really quite a linear. We understand the chemistry, right? The chemistry is not. It's not unknown to us now. We've been studying it long enough.
Yeah.
But his point is, I mean, he's looking at carbon capture. So he's saying, but he's also planning for a world that will be very different. So he's saying, look, let's just accept the reality of a world that is very different to the one we know now. But let's at least be able to live in that one. Do you know what I mean? I mean, that might not be the most. That's a little bit depressing, but that sort of realism kind of gets you off, is another way of getting people off their arse.
Yeah, we're locked in. A lot of change is locked in. We probably don't know exactly how much is locked in, but I think we can be pretty confident that a fair bit of change is locked in. And but yeah, I mean, I'm what we're focusing on in Pond Foundation is removing carbon from the atmosphere. All these spurious claims around, we can reduce emissions here. But we need to reduce emissions, absolutely. But there's just way too much carbon in the atmosphere, and we could reduce our emissions to zero today, but we're still in deep poo. So I think just getting carbon out of the atmosphere. I've been, as you've said, you might not be able to do anything about oceans or whatever, but there's people out there who can, and we need to inspire them and motivate them and get them the cash that they need to do their work. And what we're focusing on is getting people to get carbon back in the soils, and really nature-based solutions. And there's tech solutions out there, and people say, "Oh yeah, I don't know about those." I'm like, you know what? I think we need everything. I don't think there's
everyone. We need
everyone doing their bit, right? There's no good or bad in this, and I think just focusing on that diversity of actions, and eventually, hopefully, with fingers crossed, we might find that we just do start moving that needle in the right direction.
I find myself quite skeptical about anything that's sort of geoengineering. I think, as you say, like what the Pond Foundation is doing, reversion through natural processes seems to me like the stuff we should focus on now. So as I think carbon capture, we'd have to take out 800, whatever it is, 1,000 gigatons or whatever it is since pre-industrialization.
Yeah.
It's just such an enormous number, isn't it? But actually, when you do the math, there is a scenario where it's possible.
There's a pathway. There's a pathway to it.
There is a pathway. And I think that's another principle that I think in the green movement, I talk a lot about it, where we've got to stop letting perfect get in the way of good, right? I mean, and now whichever way debate, I'm certainly not advocating nuclear, but whatever. Carbon capture, the one thing it needs is a shit ton of power, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think again, we've got to be realistic, be an honest diagnosis about what we actually need to achieve the goal, and then we need to be able to say, well, how do we get hold of that power? Because the sheer amount, you'll know the stats better than me, Scott. But it's the challenge is immense. It is immense. But that's kind of that. That's exactly it. If you can get past the bad, get past the kind of existential crisis, it's like, okay, let's get on with it.
Yeah. I always say to people, we've sort of got to, it's not looking too good. We can be sure if we do nothing, we're completely cactus stuffed us. But if we do something, we just might move the needle. And, if we are to go over the edge into the abyss, I think I'd rather be the guy that was busy on the boat paddling to try and go in a different direction, than just sort of sitting there arguing about it, or, going to meetings and wringing hands and talking about what might be. I think you've got to get out in the bush, and that's my equivalent as a forester or working in the agricultural sector. But as you're doing, you're an entrepreneur, and you're bringing cash to things that can be part of the solution. And I think we've all got to do what we each can do, and it's all different, but you put all those bits together and you never know. You just never know.
Yeah. And I think that, there is also, it's incumbent on us to make these solutions understandable and logical to, we geek out on this stuff, right? But I think what was really nice about Deep Green was the fact that it was a solution that everyone could understand. My laptop gets hot. Yep. I can understand a computer gets hot, and my local swimming pool needs some heat. So, and I think if we can start to frame some of the climate mitigation and climate the new sort of climate science in much simpler, easy to understand ways, I think, easier to do.
I agree with you. I meant to mention that when we were talking just a minute ago, one of the things I saw when you talked about geoengineering, people, there's meetings getting together now about blocking out the sun and stuff like that. And I'm like, I grew up in Australia where we had a lot of rabbits. Someone thought that it was a good idea to release rabbits in Australia at one stage so that, folk could go out and hunt them. And then they introduced foxes, and they killed all the marsupials. Well, not all of them, but a lot of them. We're not really good at that sort of stuff. And so I'm like, you know what? I think we might best stay away from that sort of crazy technology where you're going to put something up in the atmosphere because of, unintended consequences. Whereas, you talk to me about my laptop getting hot, and I'm like, what could we do with that heat? It's much more, it's simple in concept. I think it's much more practical, gives us an opportunity to actually do something that's real.
Yeah.
Probably not so many unintended consequences of using the heat from a data center to heat up a swimming pool, I wouldn't have thought.
Well, it's systems thinking. I think that's perhaps another element of the environmental movement that we're all kind of getting our heads around, that there are, systems work together, right? And if you would affect one, you affect the other one, the impact is. But equally, that you can get the positive, you can go into negative loops, but you can also generate positive loops. So when you bring some free heat to a local community, then you can also, you can engender new businesses using the free heat, and then the waste from those businesses can go as the raw input of another. So it's interesting when you start to think of the world in systems and you start to kind of use systems thinking, then actually you can create positive feedback effects as well as the negative,
Yeah. So I'm a fan of systems thinking, but I always, and I'm not very good at it, I would say. Well, maybe that's
it's bloody, because it's complicated.
It's bloody complicated. Yeah. But here's where I always start with it, and perhaps my part in that overall equation is I always say to people, I invite people to try and particularly CEOs that I've worked with in the past, where they're going down a certain path, they're being challenged to travel a different path. For example, deforestation in the palm oil industry is an area that I did a lot of work on. The companies there were, chopping down the rainforest to grow palm oil, and they were being challenged by the NGO movement to do that differently. That continues to this day. Not in palm oil so much; they've done a great job, really, in turning that around. But certainly in the meat industry, in the Amazon, we're seeing a lot of that carrying on. But you can apply systems thinking and run a farm more efficiently, chop down forests more efficiently. But I always say, what's that first step in that equation is understanding your values and who you are. Do you want to be linked to the death of orangutans? Do you want to be linked to the extinction of the Sumatran tiger? Do you want to be linked to human rights abuses and slave labour in your plantations? And so I always find asking people those questions about, their values and who they are as people is a great first step. And once they've got that, some of these brilliant people can come in, they're great at logistics, they're great at systems thinking, and they say, okay, well, we could get around that by doing X, Y, and Z. And then their very powerful brains come in and help deliver those outcomes, which are beneficial for people and the planet. So I guess I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, but also what are your values? Who are you as a person, mate? What drives you to get out of bed every day and do what you do?
I've always been of the opinion that, rightly or wrongly, that I've always prioritized family. So I'd read a book, of some successful entrepreneur, or the Nike, the Phil Knight, the guy who set up Nike, or a different entrepreneur, and there would always be the last chapter in the book, and it would always be like, oh yeah, my family situation's a total train wreck,
right?
And I've always thought that if you don't have, you have your pots of life, right? You have your friends, and you have your relationships, and you have your family, and you have your work, and whatever. And all of those pots have got to kind of bubble. They've all, the job of life is to kind of keep those things bubbling. But to me, if family, it's kind of the cliche is that family is the only equity. But I would say in terms of my priorities, it's like 90% family and 10% business. And that's not to say that every you're not spending 17 hours a day on the business, but I think we can get lost. And our anchors in life are the people that love us. That is just it's the biggest cliche. And I think if you can anchor, I find if I can keep that pot bubbling and that alive as the kind of primary goal of life, then actually what happens is that everything else becomes, you become much more successful than everything else.
Yeah.
It's because somehow your values aren't bent out of shape.
Right.
And then the way you communicate, or what you bring to yourself in the workplace or with your mates or whatever it is kind of congruent, is kind of not bent out of shape. It's not broken. So I think you've got to have everything in balance, but I think if you lose track of family, and kids are, two teenage girls, so life doesn't get a lot more crazy than having two teenagers around. But that keeps you grounded. That gives you a foundation from which to work, I think.
I'd agree. And I think also, when you look at the work you're doing, with Deep Green and the other things you've done on this sort of social enterprise space, it's one feeds the other, right? I mean, if your kids are sitting there worrying about climate despair and you're going out, working for a, carbon polluting company, and that's not to say people who work in the oil industry don't love their family. I think we've got to be careful there. But these things have got to line up, right? They've got to balance together. And maybe you put a bit more shoulder into the wheel to get Deep Green up and running, not just from a business perspective, but because, it could make a difference to your kids' future.
Yeah, and look, and as everyone says, like, you don't need to explain the climate crisis to anyone under 30, right? No. It's like, yeah, of course. Do you know what I mean? Like the kids, they're not struggling with it. They're not struggling with the concepts, or the kind of the reality of it. They're certainly struggling with the reality of it. I mean, I think that sort of, we got to be super careful that particularly in that age group, that there isn't the negativity doesn't just kind of swamp the conversation. But yeah, the kids get it. They're fine. It's actually our generation. We've still got 20 years at the helm. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
This is the critical 20 years when we need us. I'll call us old farts, but we're not quite old farts. But do you know what I mean? Like, 50s and 60s. We're the people that need to be influenced now.
That's right. It does annoy me when I hear people saying, "Oh, well, we've screwed it up, and now it's for the young people to sort out." And it's like, no, you're still at the helm, mate, and you're making a lot of decisions.
Right. Yeah, and again, yes, that's funny, isn't it? Sort of people say, "Oh, well, it's the Western world. You fucked it up, so now you're pontificating." It's like, no, we're just trying to accept the reality of the situation and get on with the solutions. Do you know what I mean? Like, absolutely, it was on our watch. It happened, but. Yeah, like, now let's try and fix it. Yeah.
Bloody hell.
Yeah, and even again, kind of with Deep Green and the media attention we had, it's kind of, it was amazing how the kids at different schools are like, they just get it.
Yeah.
Like they get it.
It's not rocket science, exactly. So, mate, coming to the end, look, what advice do you think? I mean, you've been, as you say, scratch to scale, lots of social enterprise, lots of businesses. But I'm hoping that the sort of discussions we're having here can inspire not just young people, certainly young people, but middle age and older people who, many people are stuck in jobs where they're not really happy. They want to do something more meaningful. Perhaps I often find talking to people around 45 to 52, 53 is when they make a lot of decisions that I don't want to spend the last 15, 20 years of my working life doing what I've been doing. I want to do something more meaningful. So I think the message can go out to that older generation too, who's still got a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge. Yeah. And I like to think that not just inspire young people coming through school and uni to go into business and particularly, social entrepreneur, trying to make the world a better place, but older people too. I mean, you've been there, you've had startups. I'm sure a few of them probably haven't gone forward, as you've said. What are the sort of many, right? A lot of startups just don't make it. What are the sort of things? And then, we had a chat on backwards and forwards on LinkedIn once upon a time a few weeks ago about cash flow and things like that. What are some of the, not just technical things like cash flow, but what are some of the more, I guess, personal things that you'd say? If you were sitting in front of a group of 20 people and they've all put their hand up and say, we want to start a business that's going to help the planet. We're just at the starting gate. What would you say to them?
Yeah, firstly, don't think of it as a business. Always think of it as an experiment.
Right.
Because an experiment gives you the right to say, there's no market, no one wants to buy this, no one wants to do this. And then you can, as we've said, then you can go off and do something next. So I think the key is not to be sociopathically committed to an idea. The opposite, in fact. The key is to maintain a kind of a militant, dispassionate kind of skepticism about your own business until it's well out of the box, and even then to still maintain that. So I think, particularly for, of course, you need passion and commitment to go in a certain direction, but as you say, the data on startup success is very, very poor. As in the stats are horrible, because the reality is, Eric Ries in the Lean Startup Movement talks about it. So a lot of people, focus on ideas that no one wants. Yeah. So actually, I think that sort of personal discipline about really, really thinking really hard about what problem you're trying to solve, and then getting to some hard and fast data about whether it's the right thing to do. That is always going to be the right thing to do. Always going to be the right thing to do. But then on the flip of that, and the kind of personal side of that is actually keeping yourself happy and healthy. you sort of expect a sort of slightly neurotic 50-year-old man to say it, but actually, get up in the morning, have a run. No one, as Chris Evans says, no one regrets going for a run. Don't look at your phone. Don't look at your phone before you've had your run and your cold shower. I do believe there's a wellness aspect to this, which we have to attend to ourselves, right? So I think if entrepreneurship, you don't do this to become wealthy or famous. You do this because it is a calling. If we wanted to be wealthy and famous, you go and work for McKinsey or you whatever. You know what I mean? The data on entrepreneurial success is so weighted against success. You're doing this, as you say, because you can't not do it. You can't have
driven to do it. You're just absolutely driven
to do it. But on that basis, you must then have a word with yourself and say, despite being driven to do it, and despite having this sense, whatever it is of moral or existential, or social or environmental responsibility that you have, ground that then in the reality of what you're doing. So many entrepreneurs I talk to, you'll say, they'll explain the idea and you go, great, what's the hypothesis? And it's like, I'm not sure. And if as an entrepreneur you can't call your own baby ugly, then you're lost.
Yeah.
You might get lucky. 1 in a million will get lucky. But the reality is of successful entrepreneurship is a disciplined, non-emotional, dispassionate analysis of the facts. And that doesn't sound very rock and roll, but the reality is that's what grounds it. Yeah, the upside's the fun, easy bit. Yeah. Everyone knows your product, if your product or service, everyone knows what it's going to be if it's successful. Manage the downside.
Yeah, and as you say, for your personal side as well. I mean, it's absolutely resonates with me what you say. I talk about the well-being ladder, and I myself, I was in absolutely exactly where I needed to be in terms of my work, and I loved it. But I drove myself into the ground. I didn't go for the runs. I didn't get enough sleep, and I had a terrible burnout to the point where I needed a couple of heart operations. And then I thought, well, what a moron! It wasn't because I was unhappy in my work. I was exactly where I needed to be, and I was doing the work that I felt absolutely called to do, but just did not look after the self-care. And I was actually going to ask you about 10 minutes ago, what do you do for self-care? And now you've raised it. So I think that's spot on. And I think that a lot of social entrepreneurs in particular don't look after that because they're driven by this passion, this cause that they're so driven to get into, that they'll say, no, I'll take that extra flight, or I'll stay up that extra night, and I won't go to the kids' concert, all that sort of stuff. And it's such a mistake.
Yeah, 100%. Always go to the concert, yeah. Any system, whether it's the climate system, your own personal system, they run best at about 70%, right?
Yeah.
And you can, sure, there's 1 or 2 days you can run them at 90,
correct.
But as you say, the kids' concert is the connection that you need to then have a more balanced view of life, to then make a better decision tomorrow.
That's right.
Yeah.
Makes you a better human being, I think, and helps you interact with others. And bottom line is, we ain't going to get anywhere if we think we're going to do it on our own. We've got to work with other people. And if we're grumpy and stressed and miserable, and problems at home, you can't do your job effectively. And if your job's trying to make the world a better place, then everyone suffers, right?
Yeah, completely. Look, I certainly, again, sort of personal experience of burnout, and I'm a big fan of both physical but also mental health, right? Yeah. I memean, I've had my fair share of therapy, and I would I've recommended it to many friends who sort of you see sliding down the hole, and I think, as you say, the maintaining your own balance, as you say, because you're interacting and being able to kind of influence and change people's hearts and minds is you got to start with your own. Yeah,
spot on. Geez, we could talk for the next 4 hours, I reckon, Mark.
Yeah.
I'm so aligned with you on the mental well-being and all that sort of stuff as well. And it's a lot of people just don't look after themselves, and difficult as a man. Do you find that? I mean, you mentioned, just touch on it briefly. You mentioned you've mentioned this to people. Do you feel it's more difficult for blokes?
I'm very open about my mental health issues with my friends, and I think, I've really suffered. I mean, So I'd be very open about it, and I think it's okay. If you're open about it, I think it's increasingly. I mean, certainly when we were kids, right, there was no sense that this was stuff that you could talk about. But
right.
I think, increasingly it's the case, and the reality of the number of people who might be having a tricky time are probably a lot more than you might think of in your own network. So I think there's a balance. I think there's a way of sort of showing that whilst you might have times might have been tricky, that you figured out how to get through it, and you use tools, whether that's therapy or drugs or whatever, good drugs, whatever. It's sort of showing that toolkit. I think that's really important. But yeah, it's I certainly I've lost track of the number of friends who sort of I've recommended therapists and that sort of thing into, and I think more and more people are prepared to put their hand up.
It's encouraging. Mark, bloody good to talk to you, mate, and really appreciate the chat. You're flat out, you're going hard with Deep Green. Wish you all the very best of success with that, and certainly keep track of it.
Great to chat. Well, I'm sure we'll speak again.
Good on you, Mark. Thanks very much.
That's on. Cheers.